Hey, what's up? It's Daytrick. You're eternally parading. God, if festivals come to make your day just a little bit better, I got something amazing for y'all today. So I got a request from a friend to do a track breakdown of my song Prestige, so that's exactly what I'm gonna be doing today. I'm gonna focus mostly on the melodic elements and various other little effects that I added as like ear candy, but I will go through most of the song as a whole. I thought this would be a fun little idea because as I've been getting better with composing and starting to understand music theory more and my own style of composition, I thought it would be good not only for others to learn from me so I can share my knowledge that I think is valuable, even if it's not necessarily the most well thought out and I might not be the most well educated at times. I still think it's pretty important overall to share this information with people where I can. And I think it would also be good for myself to look back on. So, with that being said, we're going to jump straight into this and we're going to jump straight into my track, Prestige. And I love this song so very much. So, for those that haven't heard it, go check it out on my channel. If you haven't already heard it, that's where you can find it. I will play it. I will be playing it multiple times, yes, but I'm not going to go through the whole song. I'm going to go through individual parts. I'm assuming this is going to be a track breakdown, or you're coming to this track breakdown rather because you've already heard the song and you want to know how it's made. If you haven't heard the song, I highly recommend you go listen to it first, then you come back here and we'll go from there. Anyways, with that being said, I'm going to break this down into a few different parts, and while I'm not very good with editing videos, I'm going to do my best to actually edit this video and break this down so that way people can skip to whatever parts they want, all right? All right, let's get into this. So for the very first part, we're going to go over the main motif because that is the part that everybody seems to be talking about. Oh, sounds so magical and pretty and so nice and all that, right? Which I very much agree with. So this project's kind of a mess, I'm not gonna lie, because I made this last year, and this is when I was kind of just getting into this style of like classical D&B artcore type stuff, right? I was not very educated with this. Ignore the missing media file samples. There are some missing. You won't really notice it. If you do, you pay way too much attention, more than I do. So this is gonna be our main motif. This is our piano, and then there's gonna be a violin. It pretty much plays the same thing, but we're gonna focus on the piano for now, and then we'll go into the violin in the later parts. So this right here is our main motif. All right, and we will go into the violin as well because I feel like it's worth showing. It's playing the same parts as this half, but I'll go into why they kind of work in just a second. But I do need to point out that this is something that I have found very important with writing melodies and chords and all this, right? Is that sound selection does matter. So while yes, the violin and the piano for the most part are almost playing the exact same thing or are playing the exact same notes, chords, motifs, all that, they're instrumented, they're orchestrated differently, I should say, right? They're played differently. And with that in mind, when you are going to be writing melodies, I do think you need to understand what kind of sound you want ahead of time because you can write something in a piano and it's almost always going to sound good, right? But if you want to translate this into a synth sound, whether you're writing a heavier synth based art chord track, or maybe you just want to use a string instrument that has a different timbre to it, you're going to find yourself getting different emotions with different emotion or emotions, instruments, I should say, right? So, with that in mind, what I wanted to write for this track was something that felt very nostalgic and fun. And so I opted for a focus on a piano as a layering with a violin, with the violin taking over with very bright, powerful noise, and the piano giving it some weight to it because the violin, of course, is playing in a higher register, right? It's playing at a higher frequency in the frequency spectrum, whereas the piano's a little bit lower. It's still bright, but it can play a little bit lower, and of course, it sets kind of some bass notes. I did copy paste a lot of this, so really the violin should stick to mostly just the melody, but it is playing some chords, though I should mention that some of these chords are not played in some parts. Anyways, going too much into semantics and all that. So let's break this down, right? Here's this. All right, so this is the first half of our motif, right? So let's start with this. So we are in the key of D minor. I personally love this because it's a very positive sounding key for the most parts. As you can tell, it has, if I'm not mistaken, only one black key in it within an octave. So it's generally mostly white keys. With the one black key, I'm not even really using. So you could say all of these keys, all these notes right here, right? Realistically could have been written in the scale of C minor, or C major, sorry, because they're all white notes, right? And you notice that with black notes, you can get this kind of contrast depending on how you use them. Now, I'm not going to go too much into that because that's just a whole other topic on its own. But you can tell just by the fact that these are all white keys that it's going to sound generally very happy because if you've ever played anything in C major, all white keys, you'll notice that it's very positive sounding, right? It's very hard to make it sound very negative or kind of dark. And if you do, it depends on the instruments you use as well as layering and all that, right? But right now we're focusing on the structure, the motif, and why it sounds the way that it does. So the way that I've achieved this nostalgic sound, and this, at least this is how I think it works, is that a lot of it has to do with movement. This entire section in of itself, I consider the main motif. Like there's no real repeating structure aside from this entire 8 bar phrase, right? But this downward movement with this constant kind of ebb and flow, I think is what gives it that kind of character. And what I mean by that is you'll notice that if you actually look at the pacing of all this, the melody itself, like if I just played all these notes in a single key, right? Like let's say we took the root note of D, and then, oh yeah, I forgot I have my chords down here. If we took all these notes and just put them in D, right? Just for the tonic, you'll notice that this is the pacing where it's a long sustained note, plucky, plucky, long, a little bit of plucks, long, plucking, long, few plucks, long, and then longer, right? I think the key part here to really stress is that to write good melodies, especially that are drawn out like this, you need to have this kind of ebb and flow. It's not necessarily so heavy on the call and response, just because the call and the responses vary so much in this particular track. But what I think gives it the most character is that it lets these long drawn out notes give it this sort of like drawn out feeling, this sort of calm with the more pluckier notes, these shorter pace notes that have these kind of more like that there's more burst and movement gives it that kind of jump to move forward so it doesn't feel so drawn out that it feels more mellow. It's this perfect blend of this mellowness, this euphoric sense that you get with the drawn out notes, this mellowness that you have with these long sustained legato notes, but then with these short staccato plucks, well, they're not actually staccato, it's all legato because I did not orchestrate this with that in mind. I did not know what that was at the time, but with in contrast with these shorter notes in between, it kind of jumps it ahead to where it's almost kind of pushing you forward just enough comfortably. I think that's what creates the more nostalgic feel in this track is that the balance between the sustained notes and the shorter notes, the pluckier notes, gives it this kind of feeling of being able to move forward at a comfortable pace, which I think is what a lot of nostalgia is because when we think of nostalgia, right? I think, at least for most people, this is me personally. I think nostalgia comes from this sense of childlike wonder in a way, right? Where when things were simpler, when things were easier, when things just felt better, and even when they were harder, they were more enjoyable. That's how I see nostalgia. I think that's what I relate it to the most. So, with that in mind, the pacing of this melody almost makes sense, combined with the fact that it's almost entirely white keys. And actually, this part here is in all white keys. So, they're going to sound very positive for the most part. I think that's a good way of explaining why it works. Kind of like the start of it. Da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. Now to jump into the next part, right? So another key part to making a good melody is having some basic understanding of harmony. And to kind of break that down real quick in case anybody needs a refresher or just doesn't know, the simplest way to really explain harmony is to explain why notes work with each other in the ways that they do, right? So for example, here's a very basic form of harmony, right? So let's count this. Let's count the notes, right? So we're in a scale of D minor, right? So D is our tonic. This is our one. We got two, three, four, five. So our starting note is on the fifth, and this next legato note that we have that we settle on is the first. Part of the reason I find this to be so relaxing is because generally I found this to be true in most cases is that the first and the sixth in a scale are usually the notes that you resolve on. So by starting at a fifth, that's usually a note full of tension, then going to a fourth that also holds some tension, a two that's kind of relaxing that because it's usually just barely more tense than the first, which is all resolve, and then resolving on the first, we get this nice relaxing feel of it kind of just taking something that's kind of bright and then bringing it down to something that's kind of coming home, right? Then we go back up, we bounce back up, but we kind of play around this with the fourth to the fifth, then two fourths again, back to the first. So now we're bouncing between the fourth and fifth. I also want to bring this to a point because I think this is worth mentioning. The fourth, the fifth, and the sixth are some of the most used, some might even say overused, but some of the best notes to use to build tension and release, specifically because, and this is a chord progression that's very popular, is the fourth, the fifth, into the sixth. Because it just has such nice harmony. They balance so well, especially in contrast to the sixth sounding brighter, sometimes sounding really tense. However, it's also a note you can resolve on. Therefore, you tend to find these really bright tones that just work together. Now, if it's a black key, of course, that's subject to change, but I'm just kind of speaking generally. So, with that in mind, right, let's talk more harmony. Let's move on to the second part. So, after this is where it starts picking up again. We go to the fifth, or this is the fifth, right? Yeah, this is the fifth. Sorry, I had to double check. This is the fifth. Then we jump up to the seventh. Seventh is not something you generally resolve on. It's something that is full of tension, especially because it's just under the first of the next octave, or you could call it the eighth in the current octave, right? You keep that in mind. This means it's very close to resolving. And it's as bright as it gets within that octave, or at least as, I guess bright's the right word. I'm going to use that a lot. So we go the fifth, the seventh, back to the fifth. Then we actually go to the first, which again is a resolving note. So if we go back to this, let me go here. I guess I can just do this. This sounds very therapeutic. This is a way to kind of resolve it in the middle of this kind of almost syncopated movement right here, where it's not entirely on beat. And then going back to the fifth, which is a common theme because the fifth is very prevalent. Then we go back to the seventh, which is full of tension, and then immediately drop to the first, which normally a big drop like this isn't always a good idea. But the reason I believe that this works is specifically because it just came from a first and it's going back to a first. So even though it's an octave down, it's a similar sound and it's something that we've come home to twice already. So this is a recurring structure. So you could actually argue that this is part of the main motif within this 8-bar phrase, right? Because even though I consider this whole thing, this whole structure, the motif itself, this is a recurring theme is resolving to the first on this legato note, which gives this sense of kind of, again, resolve and coming back to home. This is what allows you to kind of reset and then to jump into the next part without feeling like it's ending, right? Because we want to jump into this next part. We don't want it to end on a resolving note too much. Because if we end on this resolving notes, the first or the sixth, right? Specifically the first in this case, What we're going to end up having to deal with is a song that feels like it's just constantly leaving home more than it's returning home, right? And maybe that's what you want, but in the context of this song, that's not what we want. So we're actually going to move up chromatically, and we're going to hit the first again, then second, third, fourth, fifth, which is going to build tension while also hitting all these notes along the way. Notice how we still also haven't hit the only black note in the scale, which is B flat. And then to build this up, we have a little bit of a legato note and then end off on the first and the next octave, which is resolving. However, because of how bright it is, in the sheer just the way it differs from the first and the octave below is we have this repeating structure of the first and the scale being something we return to a lot, right? But within this octave, in the fifth octave, then we return back to the sixth octave, which we've done before. However, we've noticed that when we did this before originally, it was less of this pure resolve like the D5 is, whereas this D6 is more of this kind of bright resolve where, yes, it's resolving, but it also feels like it's leading to something better. And I think this is where the harmony really comes into shine, is then it drops an octave actually. And then we go into this part. Should play it from here. My bad. Here we go. I gotta click on it. My bad. Excuse me. So this is where we come, right? Excuse me. Okay. All right. So let's talk about this, right? So what do we got here? So we got some chords, and it's a pretty basic chord progression. It's nothing too crazy. It's a minor triad, a major triad, a major triad, and then a minor triad, right? Specifically, this is in the first. This first set of chords is in the first. This is a major first. Then we have a major third. Then we have, no, minor first, major third, major, this is a sixth, this is a major sixth, and then this is a minor fourth. I think it's important we go over these chords first because they are playing in harmony with this melody. I didn't go over it in the last section because I didn't feel it's too important. It's mostly just some kind of static chords to kind of set the tone a little bit. But I think these chords are more important because this is where the motif starts to get a lot more complex. And I do think that these chords have a lot more flavor. So let's go over these, right? So these are just basic triads. We have a major first, or minor first, major third, major sixth, and then a minor fourth. So this is just pretty, it's very mellow, but we move to something brighter. We go to something that's a bit more at home because remember, this is on the sixth, which is a minor chord, or a minor, not minor, it is a black note, which we haven't used yet up until now. However, it is on the sixth, so it kind of has the sense of coming home that we've had before, right? Especially with it playing in the lower register of all these notes. And then we end on a brighter tone, but this is a fourth. This is a minor fourth. So not only is it not quite as bright as a major would be, a fourth again is generally where we have a lot of tension. The four in the scale is where a lot of tension start, as I mentioned before. So we get this kind of movement of something mellow, brighter, coming home, and then we end on this note because we're going to get to something brighter. These chords by themselves, this first three set of chords, there's a lot we can do with this, and I think they're fine by themselves. There's some very basic chords, but they're very nice sounding chords. Where I think it shines is that we could easily just end on this or something slightly brighter, but with a bit more resolve, like maybe on the one, if we really wanted to kind of come back home, right? Depending on what we want. But this part of the track is going to be jumping into a more energizing part. This right after this is where the drums will come in, and then we replay this motif, but with more instruments. More of the song is coming out. So I intentionally have this set of chords that sounds like it's leading up to something. It's more tense because that's exactly what we want. There's tension rising in the song. We haven't hit the climax of the song yet, so we're still building this tension, right? Now let's go over the melody. I'm going to mute the chords real quick, and we're going to go over the melody. So this is a variation of the first phrase that we had. So far, this is a very, how do I put this? It's not very too much. For the most part, the structure is relatively the same, but there are some parts that do vary to give it a bit more groove, a bit more movement, and also raise the tension a bit. But the key point I think worth mentioning is that there are some recurring features that we can easily point out. So we already noticed that the start is kind of the same to about here, right? And normally we would repeat this G, this fourth, right? And then we'd come back to the first, but we don't do that. So we do come back to home within the start, we bounce up, but then we have this little trickle of notes right here, right? That jumps up, goes down, and bounces back up. So it's starting to sound very playful, which I think is starting to add to a bit more of the nostalgic factor. After this, we then go into the G, right? We go back to the fourth, which is a very tense note. We hit the one again, but we're not there for long as we bounce back and then jump back to the fifth, then the seventh, then the fifth, which is very playful. Resolve on the one, as we've been doing to come back home, ease it up a bit, move on. And then we have this quick burst of notes showing that there's something big about to happen, and then these sustained notes where so we have the sixth, which is kind of resolving. However, it then goes to the seventh, which is very tense. But then it ends on the first, which, as we've shown before, while we are resolving because it is the first, this is a note we can resolve on. At the same time, this is also much brighter, and with this kind of upwards chromatic movement, we find ourselves with this movement that feels like it's leading on to something bigger, which it quite literally is. And we also notice that the violin will start to come in with this part, so let's add it in. So this sounds very bright, like we're coming on to something. The one, just like the sixth, can lead to a lot of different things. While yes, I tend to think of it generally as something to resolve on, you can use it in many different ways. And I think that's the beauty of music theory is there's these foundations of which you can build upon, but when you start manipulating your music to find the sounds that you like, sometimes you get these different textures, tones, timbres, and sort of movement and emotion that doesn't make sense when you look at it through this mathematical lens of, oh, this is my formula, this is what it's doing, so why doesn't it sound like this? Well, that's why it's called music theory. It's subject to change. And this is another key point I think that's worth remembering. Studying music theory isn't just about being able to write better music or just taking a foundation just to be able to write any kind of music in general, right? It's about learning how to interpret music through a formula as a basis to just kind of get you started, but then understanding that just as human emotions are very volatile and subject to change, so is the interpretation of music. Like I've been saying, we end on a first, which is generally considered a resolving note, but this doesn't sound like it's resolving, right? Like this sounds like it's going into something bigger, which it quite literally is. If we go into this real quick and we unsolo this, add the effects, this is what we're going into. Add some effects. All right, so just enough a little bit of that. So this is the second phrasing right after this first section, right? So I guess you could call this our we went from our verse to kind of our pre-chorus, if that makes sense, right? Um, with keeping a lot of the main motifs. So the melodies say the same. These are just the chords that we used in the first part, we used in the first verse and the first phrase, and I've just split it up between different things. I don't know why I split them up the way that I did, especially considering this encompasses all strings within Ableton. Don't mind me. I didn't know what I was doing a year ago, okay? And I only know slightly more now. And I also added a clarinet because I just thought it sounded nice as a little undertone to the violin. Nice little, kind of more bass tone for these strings. Well, it's not really strings, more like wind. But anyways, that aside, it's within the acoustics, all that, right? So there's a few other elements that we got to go over, and I will go through them individually. There's still a lot to cover, but I'm gonna kind of breeze through this since we've already gone over some basic harmony, some structure, and now we've gone into why the melody works, the way it's built, and why I have it structured, right? And that's repeating throughout a lot of this. This next section we will get to, but for the time being, let's go over the staccato element that I added, which is simply just adding groove through repeating the chords, but as plucky staccato. Did not mean to delete that, so it sounds like this. This is just an element that I like to add every once in a while. I don't use it all the time, but I think arpeggiate. You can either arpeggiate your chords with staccato like this, or you can just have staccato chords like this, right? Which I think is an interesting way of playing your chords. And I've noticed with a lot of release cut piano elements and all sorts of songs is that they like to do this a lot. And I think it's a fun element. There's not too much to explain here other than, again, this is just the chords, but they're cut up. But to give it some groove, make it more bouncy, give it more life. This is creating more movement. Whereas you have the legato chords just kind of filling in space, the texture giving it the mood. And then to bring some life to it, we make it more plucky. And then together, also, just to do a little quick breakdown of the first set of chords, I realized I did not actually properly explain these, which I should have. Again, this is kind of just to set the mood, and then the rising of the chords is just the blood movement. If you want to build some bright tension and make your song feel like it's growing into something, just make your chords rise. It's as simple as that. It almost always works, and if it doesn't, just play around with it. I guarantee you can find something that works. All right, so let's move on to the next element. So we've gone over a lot of the acoustic elements, right? So let's close the strings. Piano does the same thing. I have a little bell that plays this as well. And this is pan to the left. Never mind, it has auto pan. I just realized it's not actually panned right now at all. Some other stuff, some resampling, all this. Okay, that'll come in later, so we'll go over that when that comes. For synths, I don't have anything too crazy. I just have a little choir going on. Playing these chords. This is just the felt in space, and I like the kind of texture it gives. It's very subtle, and you don't really notice it until like you point this out. But if you take it out of the song, it does take away some brightness in some areas, which it's not too noticeable. This is not one of those things that I think is actually playing too much of a key part in the song. I think more than anything, what it's doing is just kind of filling in some space. Is it entirely necessary? I don't really know, but it's not always a bad idea to just fill out space with elements that are already strong and just give them a little bit texture under. If you want a little bit brighter or darker, just to kind of again fill it out, give it a new texture, and sometimes just maybe give it more weight because sometimes giving a track more weight is what it needs. And I think this is one of those tracks where I had to be kind of heavy on some of these elements specifically because if I didn't, it would feel like the track was kind of empty because you can have all these loud blaring elements, you can have crazy percussion, and you can fill it in, with maybe a nice sub bass to give it some weight. But sometimes it's little ear candy things like this. They're not very noticeable. They might not even be noticeable at all. You might not even hear them. But if the track didn't have it, it wouldn't have the weight that it needs. And I also added some white noise that I just thought sounded kind of nice to just give it some atmosphere. Very airy, as you can hear. I actually need to see if I can borrow this patch because I would love this. I actually don't have this saved right now, so I am going to save this. You can't see it right now, but do this real quick. Prestige, white noise ambience. All right, ignoring that. You can't see my serum tab right now, and that's fine. Learning new things every day. So there's ARP that comes in later. Yes, and then serum tab. And then this is a little... How to explain this? Is this what I think it is? I think it is. I think this was a transitioning effect that I made up on my own. Pretty neat effect. Just a little bit of saturation for a little bit distortion, just to kind of brighten it up, kind of make it a little bit fatter. I don't remember how I actually made this sound off the top of my head. This is just a patch I've had for a while because it's a year old now. But if I'm not mistaken, I actually took this from a Square Wave, Super Square Serum tutorial from, I think it was AU5. One of his tutorials on that, and I turned it into a transitioning riser, and I just kind of played around with it a little bit. So if you want the cool sounds like that, go check out AU5 because his stuff is amazing, especially for bass design. So let's move on to bass, right? This is our bass line. This is, don't know what I was doing with all the processing here, but this is my sub. So I have a saw sub, which I kind of opted for because I wanted to give it a bit more bump. And then I have this kind of bouncing bass. And this is, so that's another thing, the bass line, all I really did was take the root notes of my chords and then copy that over, bump them down octaves, and then here we are. And then I use, for this kind of more bouncing bass, I have this, I followed the melody that I've been using. Very dank bass. It's more of a mid bass, if anything. It's not super noticeable, but it does give it some warmer kind of flavor in the lower registers, especially down here. You notice that I've cut out most of the high ends in this EQ right around here. I've given it some shaping to kind of boost the mids. Some of the high textures are right here. Lowered it around the higher mids, just because I thought it sounded nice. And of course, I gave it a sub cut because I want my sub bass under this to actually play perfectly fine, right? I don't want this to clash too much. And together, I think it sounds pretty all right. Forgot about my effects. They kind of fill each other out nicely, and part of the reason I opted for a saw sub instead of a sine sub is, well, yes, a sine sub is generally stronger. I didn't want to go for something that was too overpowering, and I think it also still adds up nicely because of the way they kind of mix. So it creates a very warm bass tone that just gives the song a nice flavor. This is a personal preference thing, but in the context of the song, I thought it sounded pretty good. All right. I just noticed I did not have my Ableton full screen, so apologies for the weird looking Ableton being minimized, all that. Going back and forth. All right, then I have some glitch effects. This is nothing too crazy. This is just, for my style of music, I just think it's really fun to add these kind of effects that give the song some flavor, texture, make it feel real cinematic and kind of crazy, some like neuro sounds, a lot of glitches, neuro bass, all that. But I think used in the right context, it can make a song more exciting without sounding too dark or crazy. And especially for how bright and happy the song is, these kind of sound effects tend to work pretty well. So this is what we have. Riser. effects. Some little glitch effects in here for some like call and response. It looks like I have some of these gone. Yeah. Okay, so unfortunately, little effects like that can be a nice thing. So a lot of these I have off because I don't have these sample files in here. I'm like 90% sure they're in there. Yeah, they're in there somewhere because I have those samples still, but I had to reorganize my stuff and it got deleted. So unfortunately, I will not be able to go over that. But you know, it's fine. It'll have to do for now. All right, so let's go into the percussion. So while this track's operating at 190 BPM for the most part, which is a lot higher than a lot of normal drum and bass styled grooves, where it normally is at 174, it's still a two-step groove with, I think, hats playing on, what was it, 16ths, 8ths? So we take one bar. Oh, the rides are, okay, so we have rides on quarter notes. Then we have some drum fills, some, as well as some drum loops to just kind of fill it in, some break beats to give it some more rhythm and movement. And nothing too crazy. So, right, so we have our kick and we have our snare, which sounds like this. It's filtered in. I guess if we take off the filter, turn off the filter. Nothing too crazy, right? Then we have the ride. Some percussion. And then, you know, breakbeat right here, which I actually have turned off. It's just to show an example that, you know, you can use this kind of stuff. You know, for this kind of stuff anyways, even if you're just doing regular hardcore, I think kind of learning how to make drum and bass drums and play around with filters and effects and just how to make them more interesting is really fun because you get some really nice textures and it can let you have a lot more movement and groove with this kind of stuff. Especially because I feel like for this genre in particular, or at least this style of music, I should say, since it's kind of a blend of both, I do find it imperative that you have good drum selection and are able to play around with a lot of electronic samples because it gives it the kind of life and energy it needs. You can very much use acoustic kicks and snares and other effects, and oftentimes they sound great, and you probably should. I do use a lot of acoustic fills in my tracks nowadays, but having some more electronic samples definitely gives it some more life. So that's the drums, nothing too crazy, and then some atmosphere. Yeah, nothing too crazy. Impacts, risers, just a lot of white noise, filling in space, giving it some air, making it feel like it's in a space. It helps with the movement, the transitioning, and then also little glass shattering effects. If you want to know how to make this effect right here, let me see if I can't find it. Scene change right here, which I'm a big fan of. I think it's this. It is a glass breaking effect. And then I reversed it, gave it some reverb, put some delay on it, and then this one over here just has a phaser flanger on it. So nothing too crazy, right? So let's move on to the next phase, right? Which I think I'm actually going to make a separate video on because this one's getting kind of long and I would like to take my time with editing this and practicing. Also, it's quite late where I am right now. So I'm going to have to continue this another time, but hopefully this video does find you all well. I'm hoping that you all learned something from this, and I'm looking forward to doing the second part, which will cover this breakdown, going back into the pre-chorus where we have the crescendo, and then hopefully I'll just do a third video on the drop since this is kind of its own section. It does use a lot of elements that have already occurred in here because cohesion. For the sake of cohesion, you know, it's not too different, but I would like to go into this on its own because I did have a lot of fun with this. And there are different uses of elements, hence why it has kind of its own mastering channel. Not really mastering, but just separating it so I can kind of redo it the way I wanted because it was helping with automation. This project is really messy. If it was normal, I wouldn't need two different groups for two different areas like this. I honestly don't recommend this necessarily, but you can do this if you feel like you just need to kind of split things up a bit, or you want to start adding more tracks, but you don't want it to feel too cluttered with everything else. Sometimes it just helps. And during the time of producing this, this very much did help. Anyways, with that being said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this very much. I had a blast making this, even though it's kind of messy because this is my first time doing something like this. I had a lot of fun doing this, and hopefully I can do this for my future projects that are in the works right now, especially when they start to, get a bit more results and more people actually want to see this because it's not too many people asking, but still, these are fun to do. So I'm going to try to be doing these for tracks that I feel like are definitely worth it. This one definitely being worth it because it's some of my best work as far as writing. Maybe not so much on the production side, but I think the writing side is definitely excelled. So with that being said, I've been your host for today. You're eternally parading. God of festivals, come to make your day just a little bit better. Daytrick, signing out. Love you all. Stay safe. Drink some water. Hug your loved ones. Have a good night. Have a good day wherever you are, whenever you are. Peace.